Welcome to the NDIS Property Australia podcast. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
G'day all, it's Minh and Matt in the office here at NDIS Property Australia. We're here to do another podcast today. We're only about 10 days out, I think.
From the election, I think it's the 20th.
May 21, I think. Yeah, so get your pens ready, everyone. The biggest topic in the marketplace with NDIS is how will the election winner, I guess, make the reforms necessary for the NDIS, because all the parties agree that the NDIS at the moment is a complete mess. It hasn't come out the way it was supposed to be. And the Labor Party and the coalition, they really want to make some big changes. So today, Matt and I will go through a couple of the points, just touching some of the points that some of these parties are talking about with regards to how they want to amend and modify and make reforms to the NDIS. And that's pretty much it, Matt. So, Matt, welcome today.
Thanks, Finn, for having me. So just on the agenda first will just be, I suppose, the Labor Shadow Minister for the NDIS, that's Bill Shorten, announced the Labor Party's policies that will take to the next election in terms of NDIS funding and changes to the NDIS scheme. So they've said that they will increase advocacy funding by an extra 10 million coming up soon. Mm-hmm. And they said that they will do a Centre for Excellence for Employment that will provide kind of a clearinghouse for ideas and increase the capacity among employment services. That's for people in the NDIS who would be, capable of work, which should be a good thing. And they'll also be they've said that they'll pause the Morrison's government's change to supported independent living, or SIL. So Shorten articulated that the current policy doesn't really do much to reduce vacancy rates, and that SIL funding should be kind of in a more flexible way that it operates. However, he didn't really describe what that will look like. So I suppose after the election, we'll kind of have to revisit this and just see what changes and what kind of that means from the Labor camp. And then they'll also be reviewing the scheme sustainability with the promise that any changes will be based on statistics that have come to light up to this point through the NDIA and the NDIS. And the national disability data. So they'll be basing kind of what we've seen up to this point and using that as a measure moving forward with assessing and obviously making sure that the scheme is more sustainable in the long term. They'll also be kind of centralising the delivery of disability supports, including for those who are not eligible for the scheme. So I think this is more of them kind of promising for more visibility and more sort of I suppose a situation where people are more aware of where the funding fits in, because at the moment the funding that participants tend to have is very complex, and applying for that is complex. So more transparency would obviously do a lot for NDIS participants and people living with disabilities. They've also said that they will ensure that people with disabilities are given priority status during pandemic events and emergency responses that occur. So obviously we've seen that come to light over the last 2 years, where as a result of as a result of COVID and the pandemic, we've seen delays in funding for NDIS participants. They're also developing a national autism strategy. So I'm not sure, they haven't really gone into too much details about what that involves. So we'll have to see, obviously, post-election, how that pans out if they win the election. They've also said that they will have 400 changing places bathrooms, which are essentially toilets for people
in public,
in public in the HBS or FA categories.
High support needs,
Yeah. Yep. And they've promised an extra 83,000 more workers for the NDIS. So obviously at the moment, there's been a lot of delays with participants both receiving funding and also given the support and care that they need. So hopefully that will, go towards improving that situation. They've also mentioned that they will have 300 more staff working in the NDIA.
To add on to that with the Labor information there, Matt, I guess at the heart of the announcement, there was a promise from the Labor Party to really co-design the changes to the NDIS with people with disability in the sector and to boost the number of people in the NDIA board, on the NDIA board as well, sorry.
Yep.
Even though in the news there's been a lot of informal statements from the government saying we're not cutting still funding at all, they have been informally cutting the funding. And the Labor acknowledges this. So they want to bring in an expert review process to guarantee the plans will not be arbitrarily cut, because that would just definitely deal with that issue there, the concerns of a lot of people out there. There are also currently a lot of lengthy delays in the AAT, which is the tribunal where people can go to court, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, whereby participants can go to a independent board or court system and argue against the NDIA with their lawyers that they hire, which is very expensive, obviously, to appeal the decisions of the funding of SIL or SDA. So there's been about a 400% increase between July 21 and January 22 of appeals with people with NDIS plans.
Yeah, so obviously I'd like, we'd like to see that time when they're making appeals because that can sometimes, add up to a year.
On top of the 1 year, 1.5 years of the normal application. Yeah.
So hopefully we'll see a kind of reduction in that time frame to funding essentially. So Albanese, he has actually said that this is their scheme or their ideas for when they get into government, and their promises are as a result of thousands of conversations with people with disability, NDIS participants, carers, the families of participants, advocates and providers. So hopefully it's a informed strategy moving forward if they do get into government. But yeah, so could be interesting. Yeah.
Yep.
In terms of Greens,
okay, I think I'll jump in there, Matt.
Yeah.
So the Greens, I love the Greens. They always seem to be the independent good guys. They're being spearheaded by Senator Jordan Steele John, and their comments regarding the reforms that they would like to see with NDIS is a fully funding the NDIS by increasing the taxes for high income earners and large corporations. They believe that this economic policy would allow the scheme to be more sustainable in the long term. So, a Robin Hood kind of approach. Tax the rich and give the poor. Ensuring access for people with disabilities throughout the community, both in a physical and digital capacity, which is interesting. Creating more accessible housing and increasing access to healthcare. Creating more decision-making policies and planning opportunities for people with disabilities.
That's a big one. Yep.
Increasing funding for disability advocacy by $30 million per year. Allowing people with disabilities aged over 65 to access the scheme. So at the moment, Matt, if you're over 65 and you apply, you cannot get into it. But if you get in fully approved before age 65, you have the NDIS funding for life. That's how the rules work. Yeah.
Yep. So I admit, I felt there's been a lot of focus on under 65s, moving under 65s out of hospitals and aged care homes, but that transition, that needs to kind of be more addressed, I suppose.
Well, Australia is moving towards a much more older demographic.
Absolutely. Yep.
So it makes sense that what the Greens are saying should come into play here with the reforms. And lastly, for the Greens, my last comment here would be increasing employment for people with disabilities, particularly in the public sector, which is great to see.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So over to you, Matt, for the Liberal and Coalition.
So at the time of the writing, in terms of where the legislation and policies are at the moment. The government's disability policies post-election have yet to be released. However, where the government and Minister Reynolds have announced a series of reforms and promises over the last few months that they have put forward to the voting public. So these include increasing transparency within the NDIA, particularly in the home and living space. So I think this is important just in terms of obviously adding that transparency, adding to kind of allowing people to understand more how they fit in as a participant, both in their funding and the way that they can plan their funding, plan their appeals, and plan their journey in the NDIS. So they also said that they'll enact new legislation to improve the scheme bureaucracy and the way that it's governed, which has an aim or a view to increase participants' experiences. So I'm not sure what that means, but that sounds good. So I suppose we'll see if they stay in government. We'll see what that actually means. So they've stipulated that they'll also provide additional funding for the scheme through to 2025. So obviously that will be increased to the NDIS. How much that increase is, we're yet to see.
There is forecast, and I'll cover that in shortly in a minute. Yeah.
So they've also said that they'll have improved access to mid-cost assistive technology. I think that's kind of in probably the FA fully accessible spectrum of technology, which would be in an NDIS house. I'm not sure really what that
Well, there's lots of technology coming out at the moment, so we'll see more of that coming out. You know, we know what the high-end technology, high physical needs are for participants. We know that in the SDA community. So what the mid-cost accessive technology means, that's probably just the voice activation in technology, in the lights, fans, Google, Alexa
automation
stuff. Yeah, automation stuff. Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah.
Yep, that's what I was saying.
Which is pretty cheap. It's not expensive. Yeah.
Yep. And they're, as we touched on that earlier, they're looking at reducing the number of younger people, which are those under 65, in aged care. So that's been, I suppose, a cornerstone of the aims of NDIS policy up to this point. I suppose that's nothing really too new. And lastly, they said that they'll have a tender process, which outlines a kind of a new vision for local area coordinators, including phasing them out of the planning function to just, I suppose, make it more intuitive, I guess.
So, Matt, before we let you do the conclusion of this, right, I just want to cover some basic numbers that people should be aware of.
Yep.
The scheme was supposed to be $22 billion a year, right? When that was 3 years ago. We're now already at $31 billion a year right now, at 500,000 people in the community.
Yep.
And it will blow out. Oh, sorry, the word blow out is wrong. It will expand and cover up to $60 billion a year by the year 2020. Now, just to let you know,
year 2020.
Sorry, 2030. Sorry,
2030.
A few more years. So by then, we'll go from 500,000 participants now in the scheme to 860,000 people in the scheme. 860,000 people in the scheme being managed by a funding of $60 billion. That's more than Medicare, right?
Wow.
So think about this. Medicare covers 27 million people in Australia, right? 50 billion.
Yep.
And here we are looking at right now 30 billion funding 500,000 people. So 1/3 of the cost of the NDIS is the management of the scheme.
Yes.
So 1/3 is overheads.
Yeah.
And it's just crazy. And this is the why so much talking in the press about unsustainable system, cost cutting.
Needs to be long term.
Yep.
Needs to be long term.
Yeah. So every year, every few years, we're going to hear more about these cost cutting or sustainability of the NDIS scheme. And it's important why this right now is important for us to address these matters in our podcast here, because the federal election is only a few weeks away here, Matt.
Yeah.
So over you to conclude, Matt?
Yeah. So, although all elections are vitally important to the disability sector and have been for some time, the stakes are exceptionally high for this one. So Much of the coverage that we've seen that has dominated the campaign concerns disability services. As we just mentioned, focus on the scheme's sustainability and long-term future, as well as kind of reducing those management bureaucracy overheads.
Yep.
So if the elections are supposed to act as a representation of democracy, it's obviously up to us to make sure we make an informed choice about who represents us. So if obviously if you're involved in the NDIS and it's a sector that's important to you, this election is your opportunity to vote according to what you think is important.
And given all the big changes that could occur, we ask you all to do your own research online on your phones at home before the election occurs, and see if the NDIS is very important to you. Then maybe this could be a topic for you to make your judgment on which way it goes with regards to who wins the election. Yeah,
Excellent. Thanks, Min.
Thank you, Matt.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure that you are subscribed and following us so that you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this episode with those that can benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.